In this video, I'll teach you how to extend any clip seamlessly using what we're calling narrative chaining with Veo3 and n8n. Because for any video generation model, Veo3 included, a key limitation is the number of seconds that the model can generate. So wouldn't it be great if you could just take the very last frame of any video clip you have and automatically use that to extend the clip to whatever length that you want while keeping the narrative consistent? Well, that is basically what this automation does. You give it any input video like this one, decide how many clips you want to add, describe what happens in each of those scenes, and once the automation is done, it would extend the video like this example. And you can also use this for specific use cases like real estate or interior design videos, for extending user-generated content, extending B-roll, or even try your hand with this specific niche that's blowing up on TikTok. You can see that this one has 400 million views, and in its reposting, there's already like 50 million views in there. And all they're doing is extending real-life footage with AI-generated video like this one. And once you learn this AI system, not only will you learn how to do narrative chaining, but you'll also learn about 4 new AI technologies that you can use to power your content automations. Let's get started. By the way, if you're new here, my name is Jay. I run my own AI creative agency and also founded the RoboNuggets community. We have several hundred members now who are all AI creators located across the globe. And here at RoboNuggets, our mission is simple, is to make creating with AI easy to learn and earn from, no matter what your background is. Which is why even if this is quite a complex automation, I'll be explaining it step by step so that you can also understand the logic and the principles of how to set up a system like this. Now, before we go into this workflow, I think it's important to understand what narrative chaining is in the first place, because this may look complex, but once you understand what we're trying to do, it actually becomes much simpler. And by the way, this term called narrative chaining, I first heard from one of our community members, Corey, where basically what he's talking about is if you are trying to generate multiple scenes and a longer video with AI, what you can actually do in the prompt is to keep a consistent narrative like what he's doing here for the first scene, which is also included in the second scene, as well as the third scene. So what happens is if you have a video that is 8 seconds long when you first generate it, you will actually get this last frame as the image input for the second clip and do an image to video run using that. And because the second clip starts with this image, it actually becomes seamless. And since you kept the narrative within that prompt, the continuity of the video generation also happens more naturally as well. So for example, in that case, you weren't able to see, but that already transitioned to the third clip, which happens at around the 16-second mark. But the reason why it's so seamless is because of that narrative chaining concept. And so with that, that is basically what we're trying to achieve in this automation. And before I explain how this system works, what I will be doing is to just run it once, so that you can also understand how it works in practice. Because for this system, it starts with this Google Sheet input section, which is basically linked to this Google Sheet template that I created. And the reason why I use Google Sheet for this is because with a lot of the workflows that we taught here on our platform, you may notice that whenever you generate a video, it outputs for you a video URL similar to what you have here. And so most of the time, the final output of each of your generated video is going to be a URL like this that ends with .mp4. So for example, this one, if we just copy this is basically a Veo3 generation. It's 8 seconds currently, and our intent is to extend this using the narrative framing technique that is powered by this automation. And then if we go back to our Google Sheet, what I have here is some inputs on how many clips we want to add for this specific run. So we want to extend it by 2 clips, which you'll see in a bit. The aspect ratio is horizontal. We have the model here as well, which we are selecting as Veo3 Fast, but you can also do Veo3. And then some free text fields, which is the narrative theme, just to give guidance to our AI agent here on what the narrative is, as well as any special requests. So for this one, you can see that for the very first scene, we want Robin to walk in and bring a beer. And the second scene is to have Joker join in and bring some chips. And then you just have a status column here for tracking on which tasks to do next. So that's all the setup that you need. Now, what we can do is to just execute this workflow, and it will pick up all of that input data and run it through our automation, which we'll inspect in a bit. But once that has finished running, the row we're working with is now marked as done, and we have this final video now available for us as well. So if we preview that, you'll see that we have the original clip as our starting point. And then at this 8-second mark, now we already transitioned to the second video. So there you go. You have Robin handing Batman a can of beer. And then now we're actually at the third clip with the Joker bringing in some chips. So with that input, you were able to guide your agent, which is available here in this automation, on what elements should come next. So, how did that all happen? Well, if you look at this, there's actually a lot of nodes in this automation, which I myself was also surprised how complex this took to set up. But if you just look at the steps here, there's actually a very logical progression on how it was achieved. But before we get to that, I'll just start from the very beginning so that you can understand what happens in this very first input section here. And what we have here in the beginning is just a get rows in sheet module, where you can see it's linked to my Google Sheet. And all we're really doing here is getting the next row where the status column says for production. And so as an output of that, we just obtained that row we were viewing earlier, specifically that one where we are asking it to do these two scenes, right? So that's all that node does. And then you have this extra node, which I added, which you'll understand more in a bit. But what this basically does is it's still linked to that Google Sheet, but it is clearing this sheet 2. So what is this sheet 2? So if you go back to our Google Sheet here, this main tab that we were filling in the inputs earlier, this is actually sheet 1. But we have another sheet here where if you inspect that, that is basically the scenes that you generated and that we were storing here. So for example, this URL, if I click on that, that will lead me to the 8-second clip, which you saw earlier as the first extended scene that we added to our original clip. So we'll go back to this later on, but essentially this Google Sheet is just here so that we clear out this sheet for this specific run. So when this node ran, basically what it did is just remove this completely so that we are starting fresh. And then finally, you have this edit fields node, which is called initial values. And what this is basically doing is set up the initial values for 3 very important fields. Starting from the bottom, we have this video URL field, which we got coming from Google Sheets. So remember, this is our very first input clip in this case. And then you have 2 numbers here. One is the complete number, which is basically how many scenes that you are going to generate. So if you remember, we said that we want to add 2 clips. And then the step is always going to begin at number 1. And later on, you'll see why this is important because we'll actually be comparing these 2 numbers to see if we're already done with our job at hand. So now that we have those initial values, basically you have this other edit fields node, which is called the looper, which is just going to have those same fields. But because of the way this expression has been laid out, which is JSON.step, what it will always do is to just take the value from its preceding node. So you can see here on the first time that it ran, which you know because it says 1 of 2, and later on we'll check this 2 of 2. What it basically did is to just get the values from our initial node here, which is 1, 2, as well as this video URL, which if you remember is our very first input node. And so for the first time that this node ran, what will basically happen is this very first media URL, which is the one that you inputted in the Google Sheet, will run through the processing that we have here. And we'll go through this in more detail. But basically what happens here is that that video will be analyzed through these nodes and we'll just be describing what happens in that video in a lot of detail, which we now feed into our AI agent so that our AI agent can have an understanding of what happens in that video. And the reason why that's important is because this agent is going to craft the prompt for the next scene and integrate that narrative into the next prompt. But before we generate the video, we first need to get the very last frame of that 8-second clip that we have as an input, similar to our example earlier, which we achieve here, and which we'll go through how we did that in a bit. And then here in step 4 is where we actually generated that scene. So taking that last frame of the preceding video and using that as the very first frame here, and also taking in the prompt that this AI agent just generated, we now generate a completely new scene, which for step 5 is where we actually add that scene into Google Sheets, which if you remember would be this one. And then what we do is just increment a step using this edit fields node, where you have those 3 fields that we had from earlier. And again, starting from the bottom, basically we're just reassigning the video URL to a new value, which is this one, which if you remember is now the scene that we just generated. We have this field for complete, which remains the same because we'll always be generating just 2 scenes anyway. And then for the field for step, what we are doing here, if you can see, is we're just adding 1. That's why this edit fields node is called increment step. And so when this ran the first time, what basically happened is you now replace your video URL with the next scene, which we'll be using as an input for the succeeding run that we'll do. You have the complete remain as 2, and then you have the step incremented from 1 into 2 as well. So this will now be fed into your succeeding step, which is basically to go back to this looper and run the whole thing again. So when we reopen this, and if you look at the second time that it ran here, now you can see that the input just became this new media URL, which was the generation that you had in the very first run. So again, if we just copy that and show that in our browser, you'll see that this is the very first extended scene that we did, with Robin in there. And so what happened in our workflow when we ran it is it did another run because remember, we requested to extend it by 2 scenes. But now the difference is for the second time that it ran, it is now using this as an input. So it's analyzing this video. We're making the next prompt using this video as the base. And we're also getting the last frame of this video to generate the next scene, which we also add to this Google Sheet. And when it was added, this was the result, which if you look at this specific video that we generated, that now starts from the last frame of the preceding scene, but this time it is a completely fresh take that followed that instruction earlier, with Joker appearing with chips. So that's how this whole automation works in a nutshell. So now what I'll show is how the processing actually happens for each of these steps, because I think for each of these we used completely new content automation technologies that might actually help you with a lot of your other use cases as well. So I think it's worth just diving into them. And it's also very logical how this flows, because remember, the very first step is for us to just analyze the preceding video. So if you just look at this, it's basically a post request node where we are sending a request, which if I go here and expand, to analyze this video URL, which again is our initial input video the first time it ran. And then we just have a prompt here on what we want to analyze. So we wanted to describe what happens at the last frame of the video, make sure to describe the music, and so on. And then we just have detailed analysis as true, because when I was trying it out, I think that is more appropriate for this case, which you'll see the results in a bit. But basically we have that request, and where we are sending that to is this model called Video Understanding that is hosted by Fall.ai. And Fall.ai we featured a lot in this channel. They are basically an AI model aggregator, kind of like an app store. And if you just search for video understanding here, you'll be able to find that model that we were using. And what this model really does is it just returns to you a description of what happens in a given video, which is useful for our case. And so when this node ran, it just sent that request. We just have a wait node here because when that request is sent, it takes some time to analyze it. And so we just have that as a step. Pretty standard practice with a lot of these models. And then you have another HTTP request to get the information that you just requested for. And so this is pretty standard with Fall.ai, where the detailed video analysis is obtained from this response URL. That's why we got it there. And then we just have our credential set up here. And when this node ran, we were able to get this output, which you can see if you just have a look at it. It's a detailed analysis of what happens in that video. And so as per our request, it just gave us an analysis of what happens on the very last frame, and then a pretty thorough description of everything else that happens within that 8 seconds. And the reason why that is important is because when you now ask your AI agent to make your next prompt, which is our step 2, you actually can't feed it the video itself as of yet. And so if you open this in our user prompt, and we'll go through this in more detail, but at the very bottom, I wanted to show that what we're basically giving it is this whole detailed information around the preceding video so that it has context of what happens there. And this whole thing that came from our video analysis step, basically. But you can see here, there's other things that we are feeding it, right? So at the very top, we're basically telling it what scene it is creating. And the reason why that's important is because if you remember, in our special requests, we were asking it that for scene 1, that's where Robin should walk in. And for scene 2, that's when Joker should walk in. And so the context to break those scenes apart is given here in this field that we filled in our Google Sheets earlier. And then we just have a few dynamic fields here around the preferred aspect ratio, the preferred model, as well as the preferred narrative theme, which if you look at this, that just all came from our Google Sheets node in this get input node from the very first step. So that's the user prompt. And now the system message, if you open that, this is quite detailed, which you can read in your own time, but essentially it just provides guidance on what the task at hand is, basically briefing it as a scene continuation AI agent, and that it should generate video generation instructions or prompts. And then I just included a couple of things here for the guidance, where it should ideally consider consistency with the music style and so on. Have the focus be what happens in the very last frame of the video, which we also included in our user prompt to it. Just some quality considerations like defining the type of camera being used, the camera movement, which should be consistent with the previous scene, and so on and so forth. So you can just read that in your own time and also edit it if you wish. So if you have a specific use case or brand that you are working with, I suggest to achieve the style that you want, this is where you should start to refine it, because all our inputs here would result to this output where we have the video prompt that we're about to pass to Veo3. So you can see here, Robin dressed in a colorful costume enters the room and such. That's our video prompt. You have the aspect ratio, which is as per our definition. We said horizontal and we said we want Veo3 fast. And just to show it as well, if I go to run 2 of 2, this is now the part where the prompt became Joker. is now the one entering the room as well, because that is the second extended scene that we want in this who will run. So now we have the prompt. Before we can go to generating the video, we actually also need to get the last frame of the preceding video, because remember, we are going to feed that into this step so that we have that proper seamlessness between scenes. And so to do that, if I look at this HTTP request, we are using file.ai once again, but specifically this extract frame function. And so if you go back to file and just search for extract frame, you'll find it. And all this endpoint does is it allows you to extract either the first, middle, or last frame of any video, which is actually pretty useful. So if you go down and look at our request here, it's a very simple request where we are passing along the video URL, where we're saying that we want the last frame of this video. And so when that got passed, File AI is saying that our request is in queue. We are once again waiting for a few seconds for that to finish. And once that's done, we just get the results of our request. So this is the same. We are getting it from this response URL as per File AI's documentation. And then for the very first run, we got back this image, which is a JPEG, which if you take a look at that, this is the ending frame of our original video, if you remember. And then if you go to the second run, what this should now show is an image with Robin in there. So this is going to be the last frame of our first extended scene. And so this acts as sort of your chain into extending these clips so that when you stitch them together, they would be pretty seamless. But there you go. Now you have your image for your image to video step, and you have the prompt. So you have everything you need to actually generate the next clip. And so this step 4 is just around that, where we are doing another HTTP request. And if you open this one, it's a post request to Veo as the model, but this time we are using key.ai. So we already talked about Key AI previously in our older videos, but they're also an AI model aggregator similar to File AI. But the reason why we're using them is because as of right now, they actually have the cheapest implementation of Veo3 Fast. So it's only 40 cents for an 80-second video, which is very economical. And so their service is what we are using in this instance. And if you look at the body, this is pretty standard, at least for Key AI, where we are passing on the prompt. So you can see here, at least in this preview, we are already getting the second extended scene. That's why there's Joker in there. Unfortunately, I don't think I can shuffle to the very first generation with Robin, but the format would be pretty much the same. You have the model, Veo3 Fast, the aspect ratio, and the image URL. So this is important because we are passing along this image URL to be the starting point of this scene that we're about to generate. So when that executed, it says success, which means that it has been posted. We have another wait node here just to wait for that generation to finish. And then you have your get video, which is slightly different just as per Key AI's documentation and how it works. But we're basically just getting our generation coming from this task ID, which is unique and was assigned to us when that generation task was created for Key AI's servers. And you can see here, there's actually a few runs, right? So if you go to the very first run, what probably happened here is that the job isn't done yet. And so you can see here, the success flag is still 0, which means that it is still generating. So for that very first instance that it ran, if I just move this down, the reason why we have an if node here is to just capture that, which we are simply checking if that success flag is already equal to 1, which we know for the very first run is not true. That's why it mapped to the false branch. And when it mapped to the false branch, we just waited a bit more. If you just trace the red line here, that's basically why that is. And so if I go to the run 2 of 4 here, this is probably the one where the success flag is already 1. And we know that is already done because we actually already have the MP4 video here, which if we just preview that, that will take us once again to that video with Robin coming in with a can of beer. And so once you had that, if you go to this if branch again and look at run 2 of 4, this is now mapped to true because it's been successful already in generating. And so when it maps to true, it goes to this next step, which we already covered earlier. If you just bring that back, where basically we are logging that scene we just generated into our Google Sheet in Sheet 2, which if you remember would be this one. Got filled up because of the action of this node. And then we incremented a step and finally have another if node here where we are simply checking if that complete numerical value is less than the step. So if I look at the very first instance of this, you can see that it mapped to false, which basically tells the automation that, hey, we're not yet done. We're going to loop back and do this again. Because for the very first run, remember that we only extended the scene by 1 increment or 1 extra scene, but the user wants to do 2. And so when it mapped to the false branch, what really happened there is it went back all the way to the looping edit field, but this time it carries with it the scene you just generated so that you use that as the starting point for this second run when it runs again. But for that second run, once it gets to this this if complete node again, what really happened there for our run 2 of 2 is that now the complete value, which is the number of scenes that we want to generate, is now already less than this step value, which is why we map this as true, which tells the automation that, all right, we're now done with generating these scenes. Therefore, we proceed to this very last step. And this very last step, if you can see, the functionality of this is just to combine those clips that we generated into one video so that you don't have to do it yourself. And all we're really doing here is getting the scenes from our sheet 2, if you remember, which is the purpose of why we log everything in this extra sheet in the first place. Because what we're doing here is we connected this node to our Google Sheet under sheet 2, and we're specifically getting this column C because that is where your generated video clips are. And so when this ran, you can see that the output is basically those 2 scenes that we just generated so that we can load them back into n8n. We just needed to add this aggregate node because for us to actually combine them, they need to exist as one item grouped together. But currently, the way Google Sheets nodes function in n8n is that they're actually being grabbed as 2 items, which doesn't really work for us. And so all we really did here is to aggregate the scene URL field, which we just dragged that way. And when that node ran, what it basically did is group those scene URLs together, which allows us to do this last step. It's basically another HTTP request node, again to file AI, but this time we are calling on this merge videos function, which again, if we go to file AI and look for merge video, you'll see it here. It's pretty new. And all this really does is if you have a couple of videos that you want to stitch together, this is a nice and easy way for you to do that. And so if we go back to our n8n instance, look at the request we just submitted, all we really have here is have those 2 extended clips declared here. So if we just zoom in there, you can see this is the very first extended clip that we did, and then this is the third one. But of course, the very first clip will need to be there, and so we just included it here as well. So this is the one with only Batman, this is the one with Batman and Robin, this is the one with Batman, Robin, and Joker. And this expression is how you achieve this. But once that ran, essentially, it just told File AI to activate their merge videos function. And now it is in queue. And so we just waited a bit for that to work again. And once that's done, we get the final video here. Again, coming from the response URL that File AI gave us. And within the output, that now contains your final MP4 file, and for which we have this update log Google Sheet node that is now linked to our sheet 1, which is here, and where the function of this final node that is similar to a lot of our workflows is to mark this row as done and to include the final URL to be logged here. And that is the whole automation now complete. Now, with all of those services that we just called, you may be curious on the cost, but the good news with this workflow is that a lot of those extra steps that we included are actually very cheap. So for example, with the analyze video step, it's only around 1.5 cents per 8-second clip. Getting the last frame is like 2/100ths of a cent, so that's almost zero. And then combining those clips together is also very cheap because it's done via FFmpeg, which is open source anyway. And so the only variable cost that you have here is the Veo3 generation, which if you're using Veo3 fast via KAI is only 40 cents, so it's very economical. And so for every scene that you extend it for, it will only be around 42 cents. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that if you're looking to do this same workflow, but for your self-hosted instance, you'll have the option to use the NC8 toolkit, which you can look at this video from Valix, who's a member of our community, on how to do. So I'll link his video there in the description as well. But there you go. Hope you learned something new from this video. I think this automation in particular would only have specific use cases where it's applicable. So for example, as Valix featured here in his video, if your clientele is in real estate or interior design, this is actually quite useful as an automation if you're trying to create B-roll or real estate videos en masse and extending that as well. But even if you're not extending any videos yourself in the meantime, I think knowing a lot of these services where we are automating a lot of the video editing, like getting the last frame, analyzing the video itself, is quite a useful skill that you can cross-apply to whatever other use case that you may have. So if you learned something new, consider subscribing if you haven't yet, so we can put out more content on our platform like this. And if you want to grab this template for a shortcut as well as the config setup guide, you can also check out our community, which I just linked down below. A lot of people join because of the wealth of courses that we have around artificial intelligence and creating with AI. But a lot of people stay because of the community that we were able to build. So you can see here a lot of the wins that people are posting, and also a lot of paid opportunities if you want to get started with earning from this skill that you're learning with AI and automation. So check that out if that's for you, especially if you want to invest in yourself and your learning when it comes to this historic shift that AI is bringing. But that's it for this one. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.